the first step in analyzing these deals is really what is the seller, the rights holder, looking to get out of the deal. Very often, the seller, particularly someone in Israel, where it's a relatively small company, or country rather, and relatively small company for that matter as well. There's not a huge infrastructure like there might be with a big British media firm. More often than not, they are content to merely license their property and leave it at that, so that they get, and maybe after, or if there's questions later, I get into the details of what those license deals look like and what the deal terms are. But the bottom line is the US buyer will now have the right to produce a local format and basically just will pay the native rights holder back in Israel an ongoing royalty every time an episode is shot and maybe a piece of the back end. But that's about it. Those deals, that's sort of what I'll call the bottom rung of the deal from the rights holder's perspective. They're rights holders who want to be much more involved. They're rights holders who, for example, and Oded can speak to it from a creative point better than I can, but there are those format rights holders in Israel and elsewhere who say, look, this is my baby. I'm very protective of my storytelling unit. I worked very hard to create it. I don't want to just license it and hope that the folks in the US or elsewhere keep to its spirit. I want to ensure that they do, in fact, keep to the spirit of my creation. Otherwise, I'm not interested. So that's what I'll call sort of a licensing plus deal, where you're, in addition to acquiring a license to the intellectual property that is the format right, you are also engaging on a pretty serious basis sometimes the creative consultation services of the creator who may come over. And it may not just be him or her, maybe his writing staff. Depends really on, are they willing to put that time in? Are the US buyers willing to entertain that input? Sometimes the US buyers welcome it, and sometimes, as you can imagine, they don't. It's like, leave us alone, we're paying you your money, we'll send you a check, let us do our version of your show. I think what the next steps might be, if I can borrow an analogy from the countries that have been doing this for a while, like a Great Britain, is, and Scott's certainly seen this with Granada, and I've represented the BBC, I've represented Fremantle. Dancing with the Stars is a good example. For years, the BBC, when they brought over their game shows and their reality formats, would either do one of those license deals or these licensing plus deals. But as they became successful, when Dancing with the Stars came over, I did that deal, they said to me, I didn't suggest it, because when they, by the way, when they came to me and said, well, here's this format we want to sell now, it's ballroom dancing. I said, that's great, that's great. You know, we'll take that around, and we'll see what happens. But they said, this time we want to do something different, because after 3 or 4 successes of licensing game shows like Weakest Link or Dog Eat Dog, or even Millionaire. Millionaire was not a BBC show, it was a Celador show. But with all the success of these BBC imports or these UK imports, the companies, the native companies back in their home territories didn't own the show. They just got a passive piece of the show. Dancing with the Stars was the first time that the BBC came to us and said, I want to say us, this was when I was at William Morris, what about if we own the show? I mean, we produce it in the US, we produce it in the UK, why can't we produce it in the US? Ultimately, that's what happened. ABC airs the show, Disney doesn't own the show, the BBC owns the show. I tried beyond belief to convince them not to do it, that the show was going to be an absolute flop, which is why I'm a lawyer and I don't have the Golden Globes and the Emmys. I'm the suit and tie guy. You know. I just didn't think it would work. But the point I want to make in that story is I think that is going to be a natural progression as imports from Israel become more and more successful, that you're going to see the rights holders in Israel come over here and say, not only do we want to take an active part creatively, but we want to either assist in the production. For example, the project that Howard's dealing with, and I'm sure he'll talk about it at length because it's really a great story. they're actually going to shoot part of the pilot in Israel through the assistance of the rights holders back in Israel.
And
So,
you know, it's an interesting thing because this is all about timing. It's not necessarily about what's good entertainment versus bad.
right.
That when, for years and years, the British would do their very expensive costume dramas, and then to balance the cost of their overall programming, they would do inexpensive quiz shows, game shows, and a lot of reality, what they call reality programming. And in part, it was an economic decision because it was too expensive to do the period dramas over and over, so they would do a series that might cost $1 million an episode, and then they would do something that cost $100,000 an episode. And these cheap reality shows were something that American networks always looked down their noses at. It was looked upon as sort of, you could never put it on a network. And it was really kind of looked at as local programming. And I remember the first time I started pitching these kind of shows, and people at the networks would look at you and say, that's not a network show. And it was Michael Davies brought the first show over, right?
Yeah.
And it opened up it created a value proposition for all these British companies that they had never imagined existed, which was that, formats of a show had never really had much value. And so you had reality companies with hundreds of episodes of these reality series, but unlike the studio libraries where there was always a sense that with the motion pictures and the television series you could export these around the world and people would watch them. It wasn't true for reality shows until, in the last 10 years or so, 15 years.
I'll tell one story that it's a little bit of a segue, but or a non sequitur, I should say, because certainly we're going to talk about cultural differences. We're going to have to when we get into the discussions for the evening. I did the deal for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which really looks the U.S. version, which by the way, for that value proposition, has generated well over $1 billion of ad revenue for ABC, and still runs today. But that show looks exactly like, other than Regis Philbin's face when it came over, it was exactly like the UK series. The same set, the same music, the same lighting cues, really. Same with Weakest Link, by the way. But in terms of cultural differences, by the time it hit the US, it was a success in the US, it was on in probably, at that point, maybe 90 countries around the world. And they all had a very similar format. If you remember the show, there is a poll the audience lifeline. So if you're in trouble, you can poll the audience and get their opinion and then take your advice. If it was in 90 countries, in 89 of the countries, the audience typically was right, more often than not. And the gestalt of the audience was sort of, I'm going to show everybody how smart I am, and we're going to come up with the right answer. We're going to help support this panelist. In Russia, go to the Russians, the audience was almost always wrong. And originally they thought, it can't be that they're just intellectually inferior, and how can it be? The more they did this study, they found that the dynamic of the Russians sitting in the audience was, we're going to fool the panelists. We're going to lie. We know the right answer is B, but we're going to say C. And that really completely changed the dynamic of that show in that one country just because of that sort of quirky cultural difference. And with that, I'll let you.
Those are